G'day and welcome to another edition of Cuppa with the Jesuit. I'm Father Robin Koning, the Provincial Assistant for Vocations, and I have my cuppa with me here.
I'm Jesuit student Julian Butler, and Father Robin and I are joined today by Father Rob Morris, who's at Sevenhill in South Australia. G'day, Father Rob.
Hi guys, how are you?
Would you like to tell people something about the significance of Sevenhill for the Jesuits in Australia?
Sure. Well, I'm very fortunate to be here at Sevenhill. Sevenhill is our mother house in a way of the Jesuits in Australia. The Jesuits came here. The first Jesuits to come to Australia were the Austrians, and they came out in about 1850. So Sevenhill was the very first place the Jesuits really landed, just about 2 hours north of Adelaide. And I'm sitting right now in the college that they built with their own hands. It's quite an amazing building, still used today as our retreat house. So Sevenhill has a very, very special place in the hearts of the Jesuits in Australia. It is our hearth place, and it's also probably more famous now for the wine that it produces, Sevenhill Cellars, which is, I think, still the only Jesuit winery in the world. So they started producing sacramental wines here back in 1850 and still do today. So you get a good drop here as well.
Okay, and what's your role there at Sevenhill at the moment?
Well, my role primarily is as director of the retreat centre. So we run primarily, I think of Sevenhill as the house of the spiritual exercises. So this is where people come. Our main ministry is built around the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, giving people spiritual direction, silent directed retreats.
Rob, you're a New Zealander, and I think you've got evidence on your keyring to prove it.
I do. There it is. There you go. Sean yeah.
Sadly, at the moment, Rob, and I think when you were considering joining, there aren't any Jesuit communities in New Zealand. There have been in the past. How did you get to know the Jesuits?
Yeah, it was a sort of a long journey for me. Firstly, I joined when I was about 34. So I didn't really get to know the Jesuits until I was in my 20s. I was studying history at university in Christchurch, New Zealand. And as you say, there were no Jesuits on the ground. So it was mainly through books that I just read about the Jesuits, sort of the history of Jesuits and sort of the missions in Asia, people like Matteo Ricci in China. And so that was my main initial encounter. Then in sort of the early 2000s, I went overseas to the Big OE, and I ended up in England. And it was there that I actually sort of first met Jesuits face to face at Farm Street, which is the famous Jesuit residence in London. And I would go there for spiritual direction with a Jesuit. And it was there that I kind of was able to sort of touch base with the sense of the vocation and kind of talk about the idea of becoming a Jesuit. Yeah.
And Father Rob, in that process, what was it that kind of drew you in? What made it feel right for you?
Well, to be honest, I think for initially, when I first encountered the stories about Jesuits at university, there was just a sense of excitement. I was a Catholic. I was someone who, was thinking about priesthood for a long time. And something just kind of clicked inside of me, and it's a bit hard to put into words, but it's like there was kind of a burning excitement at the thought of being a Jesuit. They seem to live this very sort of adventurous life, the ones I was reading about. I've subsequently learnt that we're not always as adventurous as the history books tell us. But you find excitement and adventure in other ways since I've joined. But there was just that sense of, I guess in Jesuit language, we talk about consolation. There was a sense of kind of excitement and peace and joy at the thought of kind of imagining myself as a Jesuit. So it kind of went from there. And I'd also just add that when I actually met the Jesuits in London, when I first went into a Jesuit community for the first time, I just felt at home, which I think was an important indicator that it was like, there was a sense of peace when I walked in the door, and then I kind of belonged.
For you, that meant, given that there weren't any Jesuit communities or ministries on the ground there at the time, that you came to Australia for your formation.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose the likelihood is that you may never be posted in New Zealand as a Jesuit ministry. But what's that like to know that you're committed to this group, but the likelihood is you'll be ministering within Australia or perhaps somewhere else overseas? How's that been for you?
Sure. For me, a big part of the sort of vocation was the sense that, you know, I kind of felt drawn to being overseas. I felt drawn. That was never a concern for me, leaving New Zealand. Because the sense of vocation felt bigger than that. Now, I'm not far from New Zealand. I can go home on a regular basis and visit family. So it might have been different if I had to live in London or somewhere. But obviously in Australia, we're not too far from home. But there was always a sense that the desire, I guess, for me to be a priest, to be a Jesuit, was bigger than any sort of geographical location. I miss the sheep, though, of course. Yeah.
Father Rob, all Jesuits are asked to engage in the ministry of spirituality to share St. Ignatius's extraordinary insights, but some in very particular ways, and your role at the retreat house there makes that your full-time ministry. Would you share a little bit about what of Ignatian spirituality you're finding particularly helpful in life at the moment, particularly in these kind of uncertain times?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. I think for me, I'm very lucky where I am because Sevenhill was just such a beautiful place right in the country. And I've been telling a lot of people I have cows on the property, so I'm doing a lot of farming at the moment, or playing at being a farmer. So that's been a very important way, I think, of offsetting what a lot of people are feeling in terms of isolation. And I guess for me, that's also grounding my sense of spirituality, Ignatian spirituality, that we can sort of adapt and find God in different situations. And that's a key thing. The finding God in all things is sort of one of the classic sort of motifs that we use for Ignatian spirituality. And so every situation we find ourselves in provides a means for encountering God.
And in this ministry of, a lot of it is spiritual direction, one-to-one, and giving retreats. How have you seen other people benefiting, growing in their journey with the Lord through Ignatian spirituality?
I think every person you get in a spiritual direction situation is unique, and Ignatius was very big on the fact that God deals with each individual as an individual in a unique way. I think one of the most profound ways people find growth, especially through the spiritual exercises, is just a deepening of a sort of a self-knowledge that they are totally loved by God. And increasingly, I think that's a very hard thing for a lot of people to come to today, that we always carry sort of a negative or some element of perhaps a more negative view of God, image of God in our mind. And that can be through a whole lot of reasons, a whole lot of causes for that. So one of the great things is that just that overwhelming sense that God loves them. That's one of the most profound insights that I think Ignatius had, coming to acknowledge that, there is a great sense of hope in our knowledge that we're loved by this Christian God, by the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that's one thing. The other thing I think people benefit from is a knowledge of the discernment of spirits, which is very big for Ignatius. That ability to see the signs that God is working in your life, and the opposite, that there are signs of where are the obstacles to my encounter with God in my day. We talk about the evil spirit, Ignatius does. So what are the things that take me away from God? And so becoming sort of self-aware, having an internal awareness of movements, things that are moving me towards God, peace and joy and life, and the opposite, things that take me towards myself. Yeah.
Father Rob, bearing those two things in mind, God's love and the hope that that gives us and that discernment, what would you say to a young man who was thinking about religious life, thinking about the Jesuits at this time?
Well, I'd tell him to take the plunge. I think, I often think back about my own experiences that I probably waited a bit too long to actually get the courage. And it takes courage, to take that step. If you find yourself thinking about something all the time and you feel kind of excited at the idea of doing it, and there's a sense that, this is leading me to something more in life, it doesn't hurt to give it a go. And you can always, you're not closing doors on other options, but you're opening a door. And if it's the right place for you, that will become very clear very soon. If it's not the right place, the same is true. I think that will become clear. And then there's no shame in giving it a go and, deciding that's not the path for me. But my advice would be, I think it's important that a young man gives it a go. Otherwise, you just kind of sit on the fence. I think you need to kind of get off the fence and, just test the water. And that's probably the only way you're going to find out whether you've got the vocation or not. Yeah.
Looking back, you wonder whether you, waited too long. Do you want to say something about the particular fears that might have been there? What were some of the things that that kept you from taking the plunge earlier?
I think maybe part of the fears around sexuality, I think were a big thing in terms of, can I be chaste? What is it to be chaste? To take vows of chastity, celibacy? Even though, I wasn't in any real serious relationship before I joined or anything, but there was always a sense of, people are going to probably think, I think there's something wrong with you if you choose a celibate lifestyle in this day and age. So I think that was an honest fear. But I think a lot of it was just, I think at times there's the interior sort of confidence and the maturity within yourself to make a life commitment. Because it seems daunting. I think vocation is a very daunting thing, whether it's getting married, to marry someone, or to join religious life. And, the bad spirit can play with that, of course, and make the fears much worse than they really are. So for me, they were probably two of the things.
So you talked about your journey with the Jesuits really starting by reading about their history,
Mm-hmm.
and you're interested in history, and in your studies you've done some further study of your own on Jesuit history in a more formal way.
Sure.
Any particular inspirations that have come from that?
There's just something very fascinating about the fact that Jesuits were a very small group of men for a long time in those early years. It was only about 10 men. And they achieved awesome, amazing things at a time in the church which had a lot of challenges. Have the Reformation beginning and a lot of problems within the church at that time. So just the sorts of the nature, the qualities of these men that were able to do, and they had a lot of problems. They had a lot of internal strife. They were very strong-willed characters, Ignatius and Francis Xavier, and so they certainly weren't perfect. And but they managed to do this amazing enterprise. So for me, that's what I sort of take courage in, especially now. People talk about the decline in numbers. Well, obviously there are fewer numbers of people joining religious life. you know, I kind of think, well, if 10 Jesuits could start off this enterprise back in 1540, well, we can, you know, I'm sure with a fewer numbers, we're going to be okay. I think we can do great things again. And we are now.
Well, Rob, thank you very much for your time and for all that you've shared personally in terms of your journey and your work there. We probably should have had a glass of wine rather than a cuppa since you're at Sevenhill.
Well, yeah, it would have been a longer interview. But
Please have a glass of wine on our behalf. But thank you very much, Rob.
Okay. Thanks, Robin, Julian. All the best for the ministry. It's great.